Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Alfred J. López, the head of the English department at Purdue University, and we will be discussing the Global South. Dr. López, you published, co-edited, the Routledge Companion to Literature and the Global South in 2023, and I also understand that you're the founding editor of the Global South, the leading academic journal on globalization studies.
Indeed.
Well, let's start off with the term Global South. What does that refer to?
The best way to think about the Global South is not as a place. We're not thinking about geographic sort of marker. We're thinking about populations and places that have a common shared experience, a history of being on the wrong end of a dominant relationship, and who are now turning to each other for economic assistance and mutual help, and to try to break the ties, the economic ties to the former masters.
Yeah.
The Global South has a long history dating back to post World War II, Cold War era politics and concerns about what becomes of global populations that have not historically been part of a dominant class. So this comes out of histories of colonialism, countries that, nations that were former colonies of the British Empire, the French, and so on.
Is this what might have been referred to in the past as the Third World, or?
That term has some pejorative connotations that our current nations would probably cringe at, but it does have roots in that era, era of non-aligned nations.
Developing countries was another term.
That's another term that sort of gets folks' hackles up. The notion of a developing country actually comes out of what we call modernization theory, the idea that nations all evolve along a certain linear trajectory and go through stages that we can recognize historically over time. What actually in many cases happens is what is known these days as dependency theory, which is where a nation like Pakistan or Burundi or Ghana, nations that were formerly under the thumb of a colonizer, now have their own constitutions and flags and parliaments and such, but they're still locked into trade relationships with the same nations that used to manage them. And so in practice, they're sovereign on paper, but they still have this sort of material dependency on the old regime.
To further define this, though, to get started here, name some countries that we'd be talking about. We're not, for instance, talking about Western Europe.
No, we're not. And so there's an imaginary line that folks like to draw across a sort of a north-south sort of divide, which gets problematic when you get to Australia, because, of course, Australia is not part of a Global South because it's a very affluent place. New Zealand, Japan, these are places that are geographically south, but they're actually part of the, sort of post-industrial world, right? And so we're talking about primarily Latin America, although there's an asterisk there because, of course, Brazil is a rising economic power now regionally. We're talking about Africa. We're talking about parts of Asia, but it's generally not a geographical descriptor.
Right. Even though it's part of the name, though. So
right.
Most of this is in the South, right?
Right. Geographically South. We're also talking about populations that are immigrant populations that come from southern places who find themselves in northern cities. So, Somali populations in Minneapolis, the Jamaican community in Toronto, which is the largest in the world outside of Jamaica, places like that.
So they're considered part of the Global South, even though they're not even in there.
So Carlos Slim, who's one of the world's wealthiest people, a billionaire, is a Mexican, and so Mexico is considered part of the Global South, but you certainly have a wealthy class there. So there's complexity to it.
So when we use the term Global South, we're not thinking of these nations in terms of developing countries and third world. We're thinking of them how? What's the new take on this?
Well, we're moving beyond. So one of the hitches has historically been that in order to think about, so there's an entire field of work known as post-colonial studies, which studies the sort of the history of nations that have colonial pasts, right?
And most of these nations have a colonial past. That's
of course.
One of the things they have in common.
One of the hitches is that you don't get out of the contradiction of having to refer to the colonial past, and sort of therefore you're always recentering Britain or the U.S. or France in order to refer to yourself. It's the old Catholic notion of an exorcism, where in order to get rid of the spirit, you have to call it. And so you're constantly referring to this evil thing in order to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But you're having to call it. And so what the Global South attempts to do is say, the world's populations that have this history, we recognize each other. And so an organization such as BRICS, which stands for, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These are nations that have, right, historically been, not part of any kind of global elite.
Right.
But now that's complicated because China is, of course, a global power,
right,
and India is. But the general sense here is that we're looking at populations that have historically been separated, but they have a common denominator, which is this history of domination from above, and now they turn to each other to close ranks.
Yeah, and so, if we're not saying that what they have in common is that they're growing or they're moving into the first world, right? What other things do we say about them then? How does it help them to be understood as part of the global South?
One of the things that has defined the historical relationship of South and North is a relationship of extraction, right? So one of the ways in which colonial powers historically became these dominant global economic powerhouses was there's this relationship where they extract resources, raw materials from colonies.
Yeah.
They bring them back home. They create manufactured products, which they then sell back to the colonies at inflated prices, right?
Right.
This is where the old Boston Tea Party came from, and so on.
Yeah.
So the idea of the economic idea anyway behind the Global South is to say we have our own sort of economic circuits and networks that we can trade with each other, and we don't have to rely on these dependent relationships economically with our historic oppressors, right?
So we're still looking at an economic disparity.
We are.
Between global North and global South.
Absolutely.
But the way that is working, the way these nations are seeing themselves and how they're interacting, that's essentially what's changed.
That's the idea anyway.
And the terminology is more of a reference to that.
Yeah. In practice, you get a South within a South. So, for example, India and China are now global powers, economic powers,
Sure.
but they have their own sort of deeply unequal systems within themselves, and so that creates, that doesn't solve necessarily. It just creates a different version of the problem.
Now, the term's actually been around for a while.
Yes.
Give us a little background on that.
Sure. The first known use of the term was from an American political activist, and I should note that this has roots in sort of a mid-century sort of leftist thought in the U.S. and Europe. There was an American political activist named Carl Oglesby. He's believed to be the first person ever used the term. And it's around the late 60s. But the hallmark of this term comes out of a document created in the 1980s, an international report. It's referred to as the Brandt Report. And the name of the organization that sponsored it was, they called themselves the New International Economic Order. Very ambitious title, right?
Yeah. Scary.
That's what that was their intention, to not to be scary, but to sort of to announce this new sort of way of doing things. I'm summarizing this horribly generally, but the upshot of the Brandt Report was that there's massive inequality between North and South. There's a history of technological advances and economic opportunities being denied to the South. And so the solution, this is a very 1980 solution, the solution is a redistribution of wealth, where the North would agree to open its doors and share technology with the South and allow opportunities for sort of redistribution of global wealth. Of course, the nation leading the charge against this idea in the Brandt Report was, of course, the United States.
Really?
Republicans and Democrats. So the Ford administration, the Carter administration, and then, of course, Reagan.
But it seems like throughout my life there have been moments where the United States was bragging about how much it was helping other countries to rise up to the level that we're at, right?
Yes,
You're saying that that was not on the agenda.
Well, the agenda became, we do want to help the rest of the world rise to our level. We're going to do this through the magic of the market. We're going to open up free markets. We're going to break down trade barriers. This is where NAFTA comes from. This is where global trade treaties designed to like break down national boundaries.
Yeah.
And that was their alternative to, and so in a way,
many of those solutions are actually more profitable for the country that's providing the aid. Right?
What a coincidence.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I tell people about the Brandt report is that it dropped at a very inopportune moment, because in 1980, you have, of course, the rise of Reagan. Margaret Thatcher becomes arguably the most renowned, renowned or notorious, depending on how your politics are, European leader. It became the decade of Reagan and Thatcher, right?
Yeah.
And so the recommendations of the Brandt report were dead in the water almost from the moment that it was published.
But they used that term.
And they did use that term, and then that term became unfashionable for a couple of decades, and then in the early first decade of the 21st century, so 2000-ish, it got picked up by a new generation of, not political scientists or policy people. This was literary scholars, historians, philosophers, cultural studies scholars pick up this term.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's how I got to. Those are the circumstances that led me to start the journal, The Global South, in 2007.
To really look into that.
Yeah.
So I have to ask you, as a member of an English department,
Yeah.
How do you feel about the rhetorical value of this term Global South as opposed to the terms that are now very pejorative, like Third World?
I mean, one of the things that happens to terms, I think, as language folks, I mean, we understand that a term accumulates baggage over time, either through misuse or maybe it comes to mean too many things to too many people, right? By the time you get parodied on The Simpsons, it's over, right? You can't use that term anymore. Yeah. And so there comes this sort of succession of terms that try to improve on the previous iteration. So Third World becomes Commonwealth Studies, becomes Post-Colonial Studies, becomes Global South. Right. And each claims to improve on its previous sort of version.
So if you think about the image changing or wanting to change, I mean, are these countries very different today than they were in the 80s, for instance?
In some ways they are. I think I've already touched on the example of, Brazil as a rising power, India. In fact, the coexistence of India and China in BRICS is problematic because each of them is, of course, angling for sort of regional superiority. And so, I think economic reality in a country like India is it's vastly different from what it was, 50 years ago. In some ways, by following the free market, the free market sort of policies of the U.S. and Europe, there's a part of Indian society that's benefited immensely, and then you have the problem of masses of folks who subsist on whatever it is, $300 a year or whatever the annual per capita is.
Yeah. So how has U.S. policy changed in this period of time?
Oh gosh, well, it's changing by the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're not
as we speak.
We're not exactly sure what it probably changed since we. There have been varying degrees over the years. So I reference Ford, Carter, Reagan to illustrate that this is not It's not in terms of U.S. politics. It has not been
a partisan issue.
It hasn't been a partisan issue at all, right? There has been a consensus. It's a left-right consensus that the way forward. I mean, this was one of the hallmarks of the Clinton era. It was under Clinton that we signed, NAFTA. We signed, I believe, GATT was under Clinton as well. That the idea, the way to lift all boats was to open markets and make them. And so now, Bangalore, in India is one of the leading tech sectors on earth. So you would never in 1980 have thought about tech bros in India, but that's what we have, right? Yeah. The same in Manila, the same in Singapore is one of the most technologically advanced city-states on earth, right? Unthinkable in 1980.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me as we're talking about this that if you take a country that is not part of the global world market in any way, right? And you tell them, okay, you can be like us, right? If you can start doing the things we're doing and trading and all of this, and we're going to bring you up into the first world from the third world, right? And you get them on that path, and it looks like they're not going to ever be the United States of America, right? Can they go back? Can any of these countries go back to being a less globally competitive economic environment and survive like they used to survive?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I should say I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an economist. So in terms of economic survival, maybe that's not a question for me. But I can certainly think of countries. I mean, I'm the son of Cuban immigrants. I mean, Cuba is one of the archetypal examples of a country that maybe didn't fail to advance, but certainly opted out.
Yes, they did. That's a good point. They're a very good example of that.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of like Brazil, though. I mean, the rainforests are disappearing.
Yes,
right?
they are.
There are a lot of countries that aren't going to be able to return to what they were because they've been changed so much.
Correct. Right. And that is one of the trade-offs, I would say.
So, what are some current issues that are being debated in terms of globalization and the global South?
Well, the debate used to be. There was no debate over whether globalization would take over the planet, right? That global capitalism was going to conquer all. And so the only debate at that time was what its effects would be and whether it was really going to be everything that it claimed to be.
Right.
Whether it was really as good for a London CEO as it was for a rice farmer in Bangladesh. Now we know that the
I'm
answer.
thinking no.
Well, right, now we know. I mean, we knew it. Some of us knew at the time,
Right.
but like now we absolutely know that the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we know that is that every time there has been an economic crisis or some kind of global cataclysm, and so you can go back as far as you like. You can go back to Katrina. You can come forward in time to the COVID global pandemic, the global recession of the mid-2000s.
Or the potential trade wars.
Or the one that we might be entering right now.
Right.
Every time one of those so one of the premises of globalization is going back to modernization theory, growth without end, world without end, improvement without end, right? And so every time one of these, whether you want to call them bumps in the road or global crises or whatever, the Argentine fiscal crisis, the crash of the Celtic Tiger in Ireland, where they overbuilt the real estate market by like 60%. And there are still entire housing developments outside of Dublin that are ghost towns because no one ever bought them. So every time something like that happens, people at the top lose money. They lose money on paper, you lose shares, you lose money. But the people who are in subsistence mode at the bottom really are the ones who suffer the brunt. So if you look at who died from COVID and where they are, right, you will see a vast disparity between wealthy nations and poor nations.
Global North, global South.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about something like the brain drain? That seems to me that's always going to be with us, right?
In some form or another, yes. And we see that in academia, and we see that in the tech sector, and we see that in the business world. Although we're kind of in a weird mode of stasis at the moment with the question of, there's some debate internally in the current administration as to when we talk about immigrants, are we talking about the folks who come to populate our Ph.D. programs in molecular physics? Do we really want to keep those people out of the country? Because I mean, a lot of our top scientists and most promising graduate students are folks with work visas from India and China, right? So when you talk about immigration, they're very different conversations, depending on what kind of immigrant we're talking about.
Essentially, if no one's familiar with the term, it refers to maybe the best, brightest students coming to places like the United States to go to school, getting educated, and then maybe staying here, right?
And maybe staying here. And one of the consequences is, of course, that the countries from which they are, and this is also a product of the North-South. 100, close to 100% of the top 100 universities on the planet are in global North, right? Probably all of them. And so, of course, they draw talent. It replicates the old relationship of extracting raw materials from the colonies. You draw human capital and the brightest people from, places like Ghana and India and so on, and then they stay.
Yeah, I had a friend, professor, was from Poughkeepsie, and he felt that Poughkeepsie was a very backward city because he said all of the smartest people went off to college somewhere else and moved to New York. and they didn't have that forward aggressive thinking that they might have had.
Yeah. Well, the way that the brain drain works,
Yeah.
brain drain also works unevenly. We see it in our own country. States and cities that welcome immigrants, that welcome talented people from other parts of the world, have a deeper intellectual pool to draw from. They have a deeper talent pool,
Yeah.
right? So the brain drain in Indiana is real.
Yeah. So, well, and I guess at Purdue you're tracking that to some extent.
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We're aware.
So you mentioned that the populations of the global South aren't necessarily all in the global South. So, for
Correct.
instance, Toronto
Yeah.
has a large population
Yeah.
of Jamaicans.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell us about some other cities like
Well,
that.
I'll start with this little sort of example. For many years, so before I came to Purdue, I was a professor at Ole Miss, at University of Mississippi, and one of the best parts of my job was I ran a study abroad program, and I would take, students from Ole Miss to London.
Yeah.
So a bunch of kids from Mississippi travel to London with me every year, and one of the things that they would always ask me, I'd turn them loose for a couple of days. Here's your tube pass,
Yeah.
have fun, get around the city. Do you have any questions? I said, well, Dr. López, we're all the Londoners. We didn't see any London people. I go, what do you mean? He says, well, everybody was black, or they were from Poland, or they were from Jamaica. Like, we're all the London people. I said, those are the London people.
Yeah.
That's who's in London.
Yeah.
Right? So that's sort of an example of the kind of thing that happens.
Yeah. You also mentioned that you took a bus at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh yeah. So in London,
yeah.
Yeah. So that in London, the trains only run till midnight, and so if you're out late, the only way to get home is on the double-decker buses that run all night. And so I'm on the double-decker bus. Now I'm coming home from a night of clubbing. It's 4 in the morning. I hear Spanish from the upper deck, and it's a particular kind of Spanish. I mean, I grew up around Cubans and Venezuelans. I'm like, there's Venezuelan people up there. So I, wander up to the top, and sure enough, I'm on my way home from the bars. There's a bunch of Venezuelan people upstairs. They're on their way to work. They work in the hotels. They work in the hospitals. They work in the laundries, and they're a huge community, and they all live in London.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a bumper sticker that was popular during the Thatcher era. Because there was anti-immigrant fervor at that time in the UK. There was a bumper sticker that was popular. People had on their vehicles that simply said, "We are here because you were there."
That's very insightful for a bumper sticker.
I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah. So, give us another example of that. I know essentially what you're saying then is that people who are from the global South many times are kind of gathered together in other cities in large groups, and so they're really still part of the global South.
They truly are.
Even though they're not geographically in the global South anymore.
They truly are, and the opposite is also true. If you are a well-to-do tech worker in you're a CEO of a company, of a tech startup in Manila, right? Or you are in Sao Paulo. You're an executive for a tech firm. You actually have more in common with your counterpart in a London tech firm than you do with the rest of the population of your own city, because you are part of a global upper class. You're part of a global north, even if you live in Sao Paulo or Manila or Dubai.
Yeah.
Right? So it cuts both ways.
I can see that, probably with university faculty especially.
Correct. That's another really good example.
So just briefly, you mentioned dependency theory a little bit when we were talking about modernization in third world countries and all that. Can we go into that a little bit, and why these countries are still dependent?
Well, I mean,
some of them.
Yes, I mean, the question is, does political sovereignty equal, in practice, trade sovereignty? Like, are you, if you have a sovereign territory and a map, and you have a parliament and you have a flag, does that equal independence in practice, or are you still bound? If you are, I'm just thinking of an example here. If you are, I'm thinking of pre-revolutionary Cuba. If you are Cuba and your main export is sugar, and your main trade partner is the United States, and the United States gets to set the prices and set the terms of your trade, how much influence does the United States have in your domestic politics? Probably a lot.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you can replicate that relationship all across the world, you can see the problem.
Yeah. Another specific example, maybe?
I mean, we can think about, we can think about, the tariffs that are hitting right now. A lot of the countries that are being impacted will rebound, and they'll respond in kind. But if you are living in a nation that has a single trade partner, right?
You're easily victimized.
You are vulnerable,
Yeah.
and that plays out in a global way.
Yeah. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Alfred J. López for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.